Welcome to the Eagle Claw channel. In the Ukraine-Russia war, the biggest difference between the two armies was seen as the inequality of tanks in the Air Force and the ground army. The manpower of the Ukrainian army was on par with the Russian army in terms of the number of trained professional soldiers. However, it did not have the strength to match the Russian Air Force and the number of Russian tanks. With the defensive strategy, the Ukrainian armed forces was able to close this gap by using Western anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles in the most effective way. However, Ukraine had to counterattack with a strong ground operation in order to liberate its Russian-occupied territories. The indispensable war machine for an effective ground operation is, of course, powerful tanks supported by powerful artillery. The US and other Western countries are trying to take steps in this regard. Ukraine has received strong artillery from May, but its tanks are still missing. The Czech Republic and Poland would make up for this shortcoming, but the Czech Republic's more than 100 T-72s and Poland's more than 200 T-72s and around 200 PT-91 Vardys are not quite enough. In addition, at least 4 months have passed since the delivery of these tanks to Ukraine, and it's not known how many are in use or intact. For this, the US is seriously considering sending more than powerful HIMARS long-range artillery systems, as well as M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. Let's now examine the details of the delivery of 200 M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, which will best strengthen the ground operation in liberating all occupied territories of Ukraine, including the Crimea. The Ukrainian armed forces have been hitting Russian army targets with HIMARS for the past 3 months. The attacks that started in Kherson later turned into a sudden attack in the north of Ukraine. A ground operation was expected by the Ukrainian armed forces after the Russian targets were blown away by HIMARS attacks. However, Ukraine waited for additional reinforcements to fully gather the ground force necessary for this ground operation. Even if operations are carried out against Russian targets, which have been completely disintegrated in recent days, it's clear that much more powerful weapons are needed to completely drive Russia out of the region. For this reason, it's said that the USA, which also sends HIMARS, plans to send M1 Abrams to Ukraine at any time. After Senator Lindsey Graham announced that the United States was considering the possibility of transferring modern tanks to the Ukrainian army, there was information that the Pentagon has already provided such a possibility and will begin to send about 200 M1a1 Abrams in the near future. I hope we can do something in the coming days to provide more modern tanks to the Ukrainian Defense Forces, Lindsey Graham said. The move will reflect a major policy shift backed by Ukraine's successful counteroffensive in the east. U.S. officials said last week that advanced Western-style tanks are definitely on the table for Ukraine for the first time. The statement is a reversal of policy, meaning that mostly defensive weapons will be provided to the besieged Eastern European country, currently in its 7th month, to fend off a Russian invasion. Modern tanks such as the American M1 Abrams would allow Ukraine to retake most of its lost territory to Russian forces. Rumors and allegations emerged last month that a Ukrainian delegation visited Washington, D.C. and pressured the U.S. government to supply Ukraine with tanks. A senior defense official said the Biden administration is constantly researching what Ukraine needs right now and also what it will need in the future. Tanks are definitely on the table along with other areas, the unnamed official said. The main problem for the Ukrainian army is its inability to use American military armored vehicles, and therefore the immediate delivery of these weapons is currently impossible. However, if the Ukrainian army is allowed to train in the operation of M1a1 Abrams tanks, it could appear in service with the armed forces of Ukraine as early as next year, possibly with a month or two of training. But there are rumors that the United States may have trained Ukrainian soldiers on this issue. If this is true, the transfer of M1 Abrams to Ukraine, which was recently sent to Poland, could take place, and this would increase the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces tremendously. NATO countries have amassed billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, including about 300 main battle tanks, sourced from Poland, the Czech Republic, North Macedonia, and Romania. These tanks are modeled after Soviet Cold War tanks, specifically the T-72 series main battle tanks. Ukrainian and Russian tanks are also modeled in the T-72 series and, to a lesser extent, the similar T-80. This allowed Ukrainian tankers and maintenance crews to quickly get used to the donated tanks and put them into service faster. Following these aids, the land operations carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces in recent days have been successfully concluded. There are some issues with the tanks provided so far. First, it's largely obsolete by modern standards, although some, such as the Poland PT-91 Tawdry and the Romanian-supplied T-55S, have seen modest improvements in firepower, fire control, sensors, and mobility. Second, shared engineering DNA means that NATO's T-72s have the same engineering balance as do Russia's frontline T-72, T-80, and T-90 tanks. The modern NATO-style tanks, which the Pentagon explicitly mentions, are decades more advanced than most tanks on the Ukrainian battlefield. NATO primarily uses the American M1a1 Abrams series main tanks. These tanks contain 120mm main guns, advanced fire control, and passive infrared night vision, and better engines, transmissions, and suspension systems. NATO tanks are faster, much more effective killers than Ukraine's current tanks. However, the contribution of M1 Abrams to the Ukrainian armed forces will be at least as great as the contribution of M1a1 Abrams to the U.S. Army. But all these abilities come with a price, and not all of that cost is financial. Western tanks are complex war machines, and although an American and a Russian tank are designed to do the same thing, they are fundamentally different from scratch. They will provide decisive firepower and mobility on the battlefield. Despite the differences, the sudden change will be worth it because NATO tanks are definitely superior to Russian tanks, and their presence would be an earthquake on the Ukrainian battlefield. At the same time, the U.S. said in its latest aid package that it will send more HIMARS to Ukraine. The Pentagon is preparing to give Ukraine additional long-range missile launchers, which the country's defense forces are using to gain an edge over Russia's larger and better-equipped army. 4 high-motion artillery rocket systems will be included in the upcoming $625 million military aid package for Ukraine. The additional HIMARS came as the Biden administration sought to bolster Ukraine's long-term defense after successfully using HIMARS in recent advances against Russia. Citing unnamed sources, news sources reported that the undisclosed package would include other ammunition and equipment for Ukraine. The news of additional military aid comes less than a week after the Pentagon announced a $1.1 billion security aid package for Ukraine that includes financing for 18 HIMARS. This would be a crazy help. After this assistance, the Russian army will never be able to engage in a long-range war in Ukraine anymore. The Agile missile system has a range of about 50 miles and allows Ukrainian defense forces to attack high-value targets behind Russian lines, including ammunition depots, long-range artillery positions, command posts, and air defense sites. The Russian army has not been able to resist this power until today, and they will not be able to resist it from now on. At the same time, a senior military official said at a background briefing at the Pentagon today that as the fighting continues in Ukraine, the counteroffensive operations of the Ukrainian army in the south of their country are keeping the Russian forces in a defensive position. The Pentagon official said that after Russia left the area in northern Ukraine, Ukrainian forces entered the city of Liman and now control the city. There are Pentagon assessments that many of these Russian forces have returned to Kreminna, just east of Liman, and are likely prioritizing this area to hold the line and reject further Ukrainian advances. The Pentagon believes Liman is being used by Russian forces as a logistics hub, so its rescue by Ukraine is a significant operational success. The official said that the loss of Liman posted logistical difficulties for the Russians, with the Russians continuing to open artillery fire on the area around Kupiansk. But the Ukrainians continued to defend the area, and fierce fighting continued in Bakhmut as Russian forces tried to advance westward. As a result of these clashes, reports were published that the Russian army was heavily defeated. The Pentagon official added in his report that near Kherson over the weekend, Ukrainian forces were able to liberate 2 villages, including Arkhangelsk and Morylyubivka, both located near the Dnipro River. With a limited number of artillery and tanks, the Ukrainian armed forces was able to completely repulse the Russian army in both the east and in the south with ground operations. In the east and north, they broke the Russian lines up to 100 kilometers, and in Kherson up to 80 kilometers. If the Ukrainian armed forces receives M1 Abrams tanks by the first quarter of next year or earlier, it may be very close for Ukraine to liberate the Crimea. If you pay attention to the last week, Both the U.S. defense officials and generals, the president of Ukraine and the general of the army say the same thing. Crimea will soon be liberated by Ukraine. It might have been a little hard to believe these words 8 months ago, but now the balance has changed. They are more serious and determined than ever. Crimea is no longer a dream. Thanks for watching.